Hi everyone, Peter here from Flow High Performance, and in this video we'll be covering how to plan strength and conditioning training for soccer athletes in the off-season. Before we can program our training, we first need to establish the context of the off-season time period. The off-season for soccer clubs generally refers to a time frame where the athlete has no planned sport training with the team. This is generally the time period immediately after the competitive season and immediately prior to the pre-season. The off-season generally lasts somewhere between 4 and 12 weeks. Let's say for the sake of this video, this particular soccer team has given the athletes an 8-week off-season before the pre-season begins. The off-season should also take into consideration time to rest and recover from the previous season. So for this example, let's say the athlete will have 4 weeks with no specific training and then 4 weeks of strength and conditioning training. So essentially, the athlete has a 4-week block of training before the pre-season begins. So we've established that we have 4 weeks of off-season training. Now we need to apply a weekly structure to this program. The 4-week mesocycle can be structured in the following way. The first week will be an unloading week where the volume of all exercise is reduced. This will serve as a low volume introductory week to help the athletes become accustomed to the training program. This is necessary since the athletes haven't performed much training for the last 4 weeks. The next 3 weeks will have regular volume levels to provide overloading training. Next, we need to establish how many times per week the athlete will be training. Since there is no training with the soccer club, the athlete has more time to train. Let's say this athlete will perform 4 weekly sessions, with 2 being field-based sessions and 2 being gym-based sessions. The field-based sessions will include speed training, resisted sprints, change of direction training, plyometrics and conditioning, while the gym sessions will focus on power, strength and hypertrophy. Let's now explore how each quality can be programmed in the off-season. Speed training in the off-season should start with shorter distances and slowly increase the distances over the mesocycle. This is because the athlete likely hasn't performed any speed training for the last 4 weeks at least. Exposing them to high velocity speed training will increase their risk of injury, so we start with shorter distances to limit the speed they are able to reach. For example, speed training in an off-season mesocycle may look something like this. We start with shorter distances of 10 meters and slowly increase that by 2.5 meters each week. This will allow the athlete to slowly tolerate the demands of sprinting at fast speeds. Resisted sprint training in the off-season should use heavier loads with shorter distances. This will emphasize force production to build a strength foundation which should potentiate sprint performance later in the year when faster velocity sprinting is implemented. For example, resisted sprint training in an off-season mesocycle may look something like this. We've chosen the sled pull as an exercise since the load is easily adjustable. The load used is heavy and the distance is 10 meters, just as the unloaded sprints were. The distances here also increase by 2.5 meters each week, which will gradually allow the athlete to reach faster speeds. Change of direction training is usually not necessary to perform in strength and conditioning sessions, since soccer players perform hundreds of changes of direction during sport practice and competitive matches. However, since the athlete has no scheduled training or matches during the off-season, it is probably best to include change of direction training into strength and conditioning sessions. We want to use multi-directional change of direction training during the off-season so that the athlete adapts to moving through different planes of motion. This will allow them to be physically ready for the demands of sport practice for the pre-season. For example, change of direction training in an off-season mesocycle may look something like this. Any multi-directional change of direction drill could be implemented that allows the athlete to move forward, backward, and laterally. We start with 2 to 4 sets of 6 reps with a distance of 5 meters for each change of direction. The distance then increases each week by 2.5 meters, which will allow greater speeds to be reached leading into each turn. As the distance and speed increases each week, the eccentric demands to plant the foot and change direction will increase. Plyometric training in the off-season should use longer ground contact times to emphasize force output. This will build a strength foundation which should potentiate fast velocity plyometrics that will be performed later in the year. For example, plyometric training in an off-season mesocycle may look something like this. For this example, broad jumps have been selected as an exercise. This can be undulated between sessions to focus on both single leg and double leg training. As we can see here, the first session uses the unilateral variation, while the second session uses the bilateral variation. Both sessions use an additional 5 kilos in the form of a weight vest to further increase ground contact times and emphasize force output. The progression from week to week simply involves increasing the number of reps performed, meaning that the athlete must repeat the plyometric exercise for a longer duration. Power training in the off-season should use heavier loads, again to emphasize force production qualities. Once again, this will build the foundation for fast velocity power training that will be performed later in the athlete's preparation. For example, power training in an off-season mesocycle may look something like this. For this example, the squat jump has been chosen as a power exercise for the first session, while the step-up jump has been chosen for the second session. This allows the athlete to perform both double leg and single leg training using additional external load. The load used is heavy for both exercises, which will be relative to the athlete's strength. And once again, the reps increase each week as a form of progression. Strength training in the off-season should use lighter loads with higher rep ranges to focus on structural adaptations like hypertrophy and connective tissue adaptations. This will build a structural foundation to allow higher forces to be produced when heavier loads are used later in the year. For example, strength training in an off-season mesocycle may look something like this. For this example, the trap bar has been selected as a strength exercise. The trap bar is performed twice per week, with the first session using a lower rep range of 6 to 10 and the other session using a higher rep range of 8 to 12. For these rep ranges, appropriate loads have been chosen for this particular athlete, which happens to be 100 kilos for the first session and 90 kilos for the second session. The progression method employed here is to increase the number of sets performed each week, while the reps and load remain the same. This will allow volume to be accumulated, which is best for promoting structural adaptations. The off-season is a good opportunity to perform some hypertrophy training, as it's difficult to implement when the soccer team has multiple practice sessions and competitive matches each week. Hypertrophy training in the off-season should use rep ranges of around 6 to 15 with relevant loads. For example, hypertrophy training in an off-season mesocycle may look something like this. For this example, we've chosen 3 primary exercises, which involve a pressing variation, a rowing or pulling variation, and a hinging variation. The exact exercises chosen are the dumbbell bench press, the lat pull down, and the stiff leg deadlift. These exercises have been implemented twice per week, with the first session using a lower rep range of 6 to 10 and the second session using a higher rep range of 8 to 12 to undulate training. The progression here is to increase the number of sets performed each week to increase the volume performed over time. Similar to change of direction training, conditioning is generally not necessary to perform as part of strength and conditioning training, since every practice and competitive match essentially acts as specific conditioning training already. However, since there is no sport practice or matches during the off-season, it is probably a good idea to include conditioning work. In the off-season, general aerobic conditioning methods are best, rather than specific interval training. This will help build general aerobic capacity, which will then enhance the specific conditioning work that will be performed during the pre-season and in-season. For example, conditioning training in an off-season mesocycle may look something like this. For this example, we've implemented 2 conditioning sessions. The first session uses continuous straight line running, while the second session uses continuous multi-directional drill. The multi-directional drill could be any exercise that has the athlete move in multiple planes of motion and can be done for a continuous period of time. This will ensure that the athlete is exposed to different planes of motion, so the relevant tissues become accustomed to the various movements that occur during a soccer match. We can see here that both sessions use 2 sets of 5 continuous minutes in the first week, which progress to 3 sets in the following weeks. And the duration increases by 1 minute for each set each week. This could also be prescribed by increasing distance from week to week. And now we can finally create the completed 4-week off-season mesocycle for our example soccer athlete. We will now put all the individual training qualities together into one coherent program. Starting with the field sessions, we've included the speed training, resisted sprints, plyometrics and conditioning training. The unloaded sprints have been implemented on day 1 and the resisted sprints on day 3 to undulate the training focus. The change of direction training has been performed on both days, although the exact drill used can differ between sessions for some slight variation. The broad jumps use the unilateral variation on session 1 and the bilateral variation for session 3, and the conditioning training uses the straight line running on day 1 and the multi-directional running on day 3. And now for the gym-based training sessions, we've included the power, strength and hypertrophy training. The squat jump has been implemented on day 2 and the step-up jump has been implemented on day 4 to train both bilateral and unilateral power. The trap bar is included on both gym sessions, although session 2 uses a heavier load and lower rep range, while session 4 uses a lighter load with a higher rep range. And for the hypertrophy training, the same exercises have been selected for both days, although the loading and rep ranges also undulate between sessions. Day 2 uses a lower rep range, while day 4 uses a higher rep range. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already.